Formal logic identifies a common structural error in how we construct arguments. It is called the false alternatives fallacy, though in everyday debate you will often hear it referred to as the black and white fallacy. This error occurs when an arguer artificially restricts the number of possible responses to a problem. They present an incomplete list of options and demand that you choose from it. The trap operates by presenting two extremes and forcing the audience to assume that if one of the suggested alternatives is false, the remaining alternative must be the objective truth. You are given a wide spectrum of reality, but the argument shears off the edges until you are forced onto a precarious, highly constrained path. To understand why this fails as a rational argument, we have to look at the formal standards of logic. Specifically, a good argument must satisfy what logicians call the acceptability criterion. The acceptability criterion requires us to carefully identify anomalies in the premises we are handed. It dictates that an argument's foundational premises must be factually accurate, well-established, and logically defensible to a rational person. If a premise relies on a highly questionable assumption, it is unacceptable. False alternatives violate this exact criterion. They smuggle an unwarranted assumption directly into the argument's foundation. That hidden assumption is the premise that no other options exist. Because that unstated premise is entirely unsupported by evidence, it renders the entire argument structurally unacceptable. We fall for this tactic consistently because human psychology favors efficiency. A simple binary requires a very low cognitive load. Navigating the complex reality of a spectrum requires rigorous, deliberate thought. The mechanics of the false alternatives fallacy rely entirely on a specific linguistic trick. Exposing that trick requires us to define the strict logical difference between two distinct concepts, contraries and contradictories. This diagram shows a mechanical interface representing the first concept. This toggle switch is labeled contradictories. Notice how the mechanism snaps rigidly between two absolute states, hot and not hot. Contradictories are mutually exclusive extremes. By definition, they exclude any gradations. There is absolutely no middle ground between a term and its direct negative. The core rule of contradictories is absolute. If one extreme is false, the other must necessarily be true. A thing is either hot or it is not hot. Now look at the right side of the diagram. This continuous slider represents contraries. The slider moves smoothly between hot and cold, revealing a vast empty space between the endpoints. Contraries are opposites that allow for immense gradation. Because there is a middle ground, it is logically possible for both extremes to be false. The temperature could be lukewarm, meaning it is neither strictly hot nor strictly cold. The false alternatives fallacy generates its power by taking contraries, which have a middle ground, and forcing them to behave as strict contradictories. We can apply this toggle and slider model to dissect highly polarized real-world debates. Consider how arguments are constructed around complex societal issues like abortion. Let's lay out the first premise of a very common argument in standard form. Abortion is either morally obligatory or morally prohibited. The arguer then introduces the second premise. Since no one argues that it is morally obligatory, it must therefore be prohibited. This diagram shows exactly how the trap is set. The terms morally obligatory and morally prohibited are locked to the absolute furthest extremes of the track.
The structural flaw here is that the arguer is treating right and wrong as strict contradictories. The argument asks you to assume these two extreme poles exhaust all human moral options. But if we shatter that assumption, the node breaks free, gliding to the center to identify a valid third option, morally permissible. By inserting this valid middle ground alternative, the rigid logic of the original argument collapses. Both of the initial extremes can be false. Because the argument omitted the permissible middle ground, its foundational premise is unacceptable. The conclusion simply cannot logically follow. We see this exact logical error in arguments concerning the origins and natural states of the universe. Take the traditional design argument. It posits that either a divine creator built the universe exactly as it is, or the universe occurred by pure chance. The conclusion drawn is that because a highly complex universe happening by pure random chance is statistically unlikely, a creator must have built it. This diagram shows the false binary at play. Two rigid boxes, created as is, and pure chance, with a toggle switch jammed between them. This limits the options to two extremes, assuming the failure of the chance hypothesis guarantees the truth of the creator hypothesis. But a third option wedges between them: natural selection. Natural selection is a highly complex, traceable causal process. It differs entirely from pure chance, proving the initial options did not exhaust all plausible reality. This fallacy scales down from grand philosophical arguments directly into our rapid, everyday conversational phrasing. Consider the trap in the common phrase, "If you are not for me, you must be against me," or the identical trap, "If you are not a theist, you must be an atheist." Both of these statements inappropriately treat contraries as contradictories. They erase the valid, neutral middle ground, like simple indifference or agnosticism. These rhetorical traps bypass our logical filters. They create a false sense of tribalism, demanding we pick a side in a binary that doesn't actually exist. To dismantle this tactic in real time, start with a simple rule of thumb. Genuine either-or situations, true contradictories, are exceptionally rare in complex human affairs. You can navigate these traps using a three-step tactical response. Step 1. When presented with an either-or framework, treat it with immediate skepticism. Ask the arguer directly if their two options truly exhaust all plausible reality. Step 2. If the arguer cannot or will not provide additional options, step in and explicitly inject the middle ground alternatives into the conversation yourself. Step 3. Challenge the arguer to logically prove why your newly introduced alternatives do not qualify as plausible solutions. This maneuver effectively shifts the burden of proof. It forces the arguer to defend their omissions rather than just loudly championing their extremes. This animation shows the precise effect of the strategy. It takes a rigid binary and physically stretches it back into a continuous spectrum. This approach de-escalates conflict. Instead of attacking your opponent directly, you simply nullify the false binary their argument relies on. Mastering the acceptability criterion gives you a working shield against these unwarranted assumptions. True intellectual rigor does not come from successfully picking the correct side of a false binary. It comes from having the clarity to recognize the entire spectrum of possibilities that a flawed argument attempts to hide.